Okay, hello. Today we're going to take, it's a beautiful breezy morning here, and we're going to take some time to talk about yin and yang, the yin yang symbol itself, really, which, like the I Ching, which was the subject of our last video, is something, a concept and a representation of a concept that actually predates both the emergence of Taoism and Confucianism in the second half of the first millennium BCE. So we want to take a look at that, and we're looking today, what's our purpose today? Our purpose today is to look at very basic concepts that inform Chinese philosophy in general, Chinese thinking in general, and I think we can find them by looking at this. And maybe we can, while we're at it, uh, undo some myths and get a little clearer, more educated understanding of what it is that we're looking at when we look at the Taijitu. Taiji, the great ultimate, I'm going to explain what that means. It's one of the stages of being that is expressed in the symbol. And so the Taijitu is literally the name of the symbol, the name of, and notice if we try and talk about Chinese philosophy or Taoism, you often find yourself talking about the yin yang symbol, a fairly awkward construction. And indeed, there is a word for it itself, Taijitu, which also, by the way, has had many different forms. It's actually this sort of the modern one is the modern Tai Chi, sorry, yin yang symbol that you're familiar with looks modern. It looks like something that it looks like a modernist logo. Probably not totally coincidentally, but I mean it's a beautiful, beautiful symbol to be sure. I think one of the most beautiful symbols of all. Okay, so so let us then talk about cosmology because there is a whole cosmology. What is cosmology? The logos of the cosmos, the study of the cosmos or the universe. That is the study of the origin of the universe, of the size and shape of the universe, the ultimate fate of the universe. And every civilization that we look at has cosmology, of course, including our own. And as I say, in the Taijitsu, there is a really whole kind of ancient physics expressed. And so we're going to look at that here just for a second. There are two states, the Wu Ji, Wu, emptiness, Qi, energy. An interesting commonality between sub-Asian and Far Eastern metaphysics is this use of the empty space, kind of the notion of receptivity. Like all physics, one of the things that's going on here is that you're trying to figure out how the energy gets into the system. So thinking about this sort of initial state of emptiness. Now here's that second bullet point. There is something I want to look at just for a second here because it's a conceptual issue. Um, in fact, let me even step out just to, for I don't know, dramatic purposes. You see, so you hear about, so in this case, we're talking about the Wu Ji, the initial state of unity, and you have a word like limitless, so without boundaries. And so typically then the way you would conceive of that is that what we're talking about is kind of infinite space, so a void, kind of limitless space. And so that's a kind of externally sort of looking notion of emptiness. But limitless also here, I think in a sense, it looks like it's more that if there is no individuation, if you're talking about a state of unity, then limitless in the sense that there aren't any surfaces, really. I mean, there aren't any things that are distinguished from any other things. Thus, there is no limit to something's being a thing. I mean, something's a lamp in as much as it's not anything else, and it is something specific. But in the Wu Ji, there's nothing specific and there's nothing that isn't anything else. And so that's really the sense of limitless there in the sense of void. Not, I think, not so much spatial. I think having that sort of spatial interpretation of it is a little bit reductive, really, because it's getting more at something like emptiness of nothingness, right, as a state of being. Okay, well, anyway, just shagging flies here, folks. Just thinking out loud. Where are we? Here we are. Okay. So a couple things there. Again, that's bullet point two I just talked about. Emptiness, not nothing. Nothing is the whole other thing. That's why nothing is an interesting concept. We're not here to talk about nothing today. I love the way the grammar of nothing works. But anyway, uh, Wuji without an axis. We're going, of course, we're getting here to yin yang and understanding what yin yang is about. Sometimes you could say maybe yin without axis, yang with axis. Wuji without an axis, or without a tent pole, you might say, without an axis that's turning the wheel to move things, without a tent pole that's making the space things could be in. A state of, so notice, in Wuji, yin and yang are not separated. And I will say somewhere in here, yin yang as one word is a noun referring to one thing. So this is important. They're the same thing. So, and not coincidentally or something. I mean, in order for something to be receptive, there has to be something that could happen. In order for something to be something that could happen, there has to be something where that could happen. So really the philosophically interesting issue is this movement getting from a state of oneness to the state of the many. And the claim here, I think, really is that the state of oneness, Wu Ji itself, is one that is logically going to be able to separate out to receptivity and potentiality. Again, receptivity is yin and potentiality is yang. I'm using these more sort of technical words deliberately. I'm going to get to what I'm doing here in a slide, not over the next couple of slides, because we want to get away from some too easy conceptions, and I want to show the sort of equality and duality and unity, really, of yin and yang. So then there's a movement, and you think, and the description of it will go when we get to the Tao Te Ching. We're now moving into Taoism, the Tao Te Ching, and so you get the idea of, if you've seen sort of a film of a cell dividing, and then and it's the spinning motion like a centrifugal motion. That is what the Taijitu looks like. So first, the elements, which are represented by the 8 trigrams of the I Ching. And notice the trigrams have 3 lines. You have 2 possibilities, solid line, broken line, but the trigrams are arranged in trios because that way each trigram has a yin or a yang power. So then the Taiji, which the Taijitu is a representation of, is this next stage of being when its being starts to then rotate on this axis. The idea also, notice here, is you've got to figure out how energy gets into the system. Why is there energy? Why is there change? Why is that? Why is it not just static? What is it that's animating the matter? And so you want to have a theory of that. And we can get a little bit further into that. So as I say, you have a lot of different versions. There's also sequences. Sometimes, I mean, we're used to just seeing the good old, what we call the yin yang symbol, which is a version of the Taijitu. But there also are versions where you see 5 or 6 different circles in a row, graphically representing some kind of process. So as I said, yin yang names one thing. And Chinese medicine, very much based on this, very much based on the notion of a proper balance, and holism. So again, an equality between the yin and the yang, a balance between two forces, rather than a conception, totalizing conception where one represents a force that's supposed to sort of take over everything. Not such a not just a swift dynamic. As I say, you really want to see what's pretty clear in the symbol, I think, which is that it's a symbol of motion and movement. And it's the movement, of course, the centrifugal movement that's actually throwing off the two things. It's actually causing the multiplicity to emerge and spin off out of the unity, from a unity of oneness to a multiplicity, a whole it's made out of parts. Well, that's the movement. It's a productive movement. So the Wuji, where you just have potentiality and actuality, you got to notice, and potentiality and productivity, two sides of the same coin. You can't conceive of one without the other. And then you have the Taiji, the great ultimate, which is where we are, right? Where there's this constant proliferation of new things. And of course, this is going to be seen in ancient times in terms of the proliferation of the seasons and the harvests. It's that engine of nature, really, because they don't have cable. The elements separated first, the most basic things, that is. You start the axis rotating, and the first things that kind of are thrown out by the force are the most basic things. And then through that continued movement, you get the proliferation of everything else. So that, in a nutshell, is the cosmological story that is told here by Taijitu. Let's take a look at a few other basic conceptual parts of it. First of all, this thing about opposites. I mean, now here we are. Let's be in the service of good here. It's awfully tempting. I mean, you can easily see a sort of paradoxical side if you approach Asian thought in terms of saying, well, it's against polarities or dualities, and you think, well, which polarities and dualities? Well, how about this million polarities and dualities over there? And so the next thing you know is you're involved in sort of constructing these lists of dualities. And then not only that, but then it's human nature to start to sort of put them into these two columns, name the columns. Maybe one of them is the positive and one of them is the negative. And so we'll assign all of these dualities. And the thing is, I just would want to really emphasize that that's all just mental formation, and that's exactly what this teaching is telling you not to do. Let's take a look at the concept of opposites for a moment, and I think you might see what I'm saying. Really, when we look at ancient physics, which is what we're doing here, you tend to see, in terms of the grammar of it, a bit of an equivocation. If you say something like opposites are one, so you've got, you could have univocal or bivocal. What does that mean? I'm sorry to use a fancy word, but think of it this way. You don't think of heat and cold, say, as that there's sort of a god of heat at one end and a god of cold at the other. You could conceive of it as that there are these two things, the hot and the cold, and they're at war with each other. Remember, you want to get your energy into the system. You want to explain why nature moves and changes. So, but you see, when you say something like opposites are one, that what you're really looking at with heat and cold is temperature. You just some kind of, so it's one thing. And another issue, of course, is if you're thinking about what's true, what's really true, and then you look at something like temperature and you think, well, cold compared to another state, but hot compared to yet another state. So it's both cold and hot. So it seems to be contradictory. And these sort of running together of logical problems with physical problems is something that is very characteristic of ancient thought. So So the coextensive opposites, the movement from hot to cold, the movement from light to dark, and so on, this seems to be the nature of things, and also sort of gets energy in the system. So typically, and this certainly is true in Taoism, in the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, that if you're talking about opposites, you're talking about these kinds of cosmological opposites. We could call them relative opposites. They're really coextensive opposites. That's the phrase I used there in the first bullet point. So, and that's really the thing that's got people's, that's usually really what's being discussed. And then we have things that in our own lives that contrast very strongly. They contrast very strongly, like maybe like male and female is, I think, to me, the one that really kind of jumps out as something where people go flying off, right? I think, well, that's some kind of opposite. Male and female are not actually opposites, although it is true that male and female emerges in life forms through this kind of process of creative duality. It's a kind of a dialectical monism, if you will. That's a fancy phrase again. What does that mean? It's everything's one, but everything's one in a way that it's interacting with itself. Death and life look like opposites, but they're not really opposites. There's a process which is life. Um, so, so an irony, I think, with Taoism in particular and Yin Yang studies in particular, I think, is to sort of people use it as a platform and they build all these mental projections. And this was absolutely true in ancient times as well. It certainly is true that in classical China, you had, for example, a sexist status quo that was defended and grounded in dualistic thinking like that. But I believe, and I don't make this kind of stuff up, I'm not idiosyncratic. Um, there's a view that I think you can make sense of yourself. You don't need me to tell you about it, but that reifying the dualities, right, and let it, right, and letting the dualities take root in your mind like that is exactly what this teaching is telling you not to do. Finally, and then in logic, of course, if we're thinking conceptually, we think of, but notice in conceptually, in logic, you don't really have actually opposites. You have something is and something is not. Something is not that other thing. Or it is the case of something, or it could not be. That is P or not P. That is what you have is negation, which is interesting. Negation is an interesting philosophical topic. But the punchline here, then, if you look at bullet point number 4, the last one on the slide there, though, is that actually, you know, the funny thing is when you get to the end of this, there aren't really any such things as opposites in the way that we usually think of opposites. There isn't really anything that's the opposite of anything else. In theism, in religious studies, you call this Manichean, the idea that there's God and Satan, two poles fighting against each other, versus the more Platonic or Abrahamic monotheistic view, which is what you call univocal, one source of values, which is that you're either in the light or you're so far away that you're in the darkness. There's only one source. There's just goodness or the absence of goodness. So, and I think here, of course, like with, for example, the ancient Stoics and also the early modern philosopher Spinoza, what we have is a teaching that the right thing to do is to get in touch with the movement of nature. And that's the real point. So let's move on with that. About the one and the many, last cosmological point. The cosmological or metaphysical topic here is the movement from the one and the many rather than dividing the world up into some two weird halves or something. You have to explain the many, you have to explain the multitude in terms of the one. And what is it about the one such that the one is the sort of source of the multitude? And this is the conceptual inseparability of potentiality and productivity, that they are two sides of the same coin, that you can't have one without the other, and in fact that they are in that sense identical. Uh, and Wuji is that initial state where they only exist as one entity. There is no differentiation. There is no multiplicity in Wuji. There is no one and another thing. I've noticed also here, and again, remembering this warning not to let the duality go to your head. Uh, all particularity is generated by the interaction of potentiality and productivity. That is, so causation moves in both ways. Holism, in the Asian version, that everything is one, entails that what we might think of as cause and effect is always sort of mutual causation. Um, so, so wisdom here, as I said, is getting in touch with the movement of qi. Qi is the energy that's being moved here, the energy of me that's moving the axis of the Taijitu. I think this might be the last thing to say here. Um, there are a bunch of, we're going to now start to look, I'm going to do the Han Dynasty, we're going to do some humanities and art stuff next video, but after that we'll take a look at the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu. And there we will find a number of interesting conceptual issues, and one of them will be this kind of denial that there's really any such thing as positive and negative in reality, which, among other things, and I'll talk about this when we get to it, but as a teacher, you know, really it may sound corny, but I mean, this idea that, well, you know, you're just going to say, there's no such thing as right and wrong strikes me fairly. I mean, I'm not gonna sort of glibly sort of teach something like that. I mean, that needs a lot of unpacking, especially when we're all there, you know, and people there as young adults and trying to figure out what they think about things. So second bullet point is clear enough that good and evil are mutually dependent and coextensive. Not all traditions actually accept that. But I think most people sitting around the candle at 2 o'clock in the morning will agree that really you couldn't have good without evil. Again, the problem of that is the attraction that it has that you should go be like a, you know, use heroin and dress all in black and swear a lot. I mean, you know, it's because it's okay because good and evil are coextensive. You know, see, that's my worry, as I said, as a teacher, because you're supposed to be a role model. And in general, it's just, you know, Taoism is a kind of, Taoism is really a big tradition. Taoism is not a doctrinaire kind of cultural artifact. Taoism is a sprawling agrarian tradition. It's folk. Taoism is a folk tradition. This is folk wisdom about nature and natural processes. And there is, in fact, definitely a position that a wise person who is a practitioner of nature worship and folk wisdom is going to tell you that nothing's right and wrong. That is, things are happening for a reason. There are processes. Someone who grew up on a farm is going to tell you about that. They're going to know about that, life and death. Um, but again, that's not something to be said glibly. You know, you want to look more at what that means. The Confucian response, like the response of people like Protagoras and the Sophists in other parts of the world, and around the same time as Confucius, by the way, was that it's precisely because of this kind of existentially amoral condition of nature that we actually need to depend on our laws. Heraclitus says, defend your laws as you would your city wall. So one response to this is to say, yeah, damn straight, and that's exactly why we need these human conventions. So that's one response. And I'll just mention, just to get our minds around the topic here, another way of looking at it. In Indian traditions, Hindu traditions, Tantra is about getting over some of these constructed dualistic kind of reactions like disgust. So think about being, say, a nurse or a soldier or someone in other some kind of other potentially sort of traumatic situation, or just think about being a parent changing diapers, by the way, which I've done a lot of. And proper tantra is like, well, this disgust that I'm feeling here is not real, you know. Um, when my teenager doesn't like the old folks using the bathroom, so well, you need some tantra because that's a mental formation. I mean, I know you think it's, you're reacting to something. So I only throw that in here, referring to another tradition, because just to try and get our hands around sort of what this paradox, we have to come to grips, that is, with the sort of paradoxical nature of reality, that we don't have the good without the bad, and we have to sort of try and process that somehow. And I think as a teacher who's done this a few times, that's a big challenge of working with the Tao Te Ching, because it does keep insisting that uh, our notions of positive and negative are not real, and that's uh, it's difficult. It's a difficult thing to say. Right, let me see if there's anything else here. No. Okay. All right. So that's just, again, a very basic introduction to what to yin yang, to yin yang itself, the concept, the way that duality works. The key to it is seeing that the two sides of the same coin is a way of getting us from the one to the many, because that really is sort of the metaphysical challenge that's being looked at here. So just trying to get to the concept, and then this puts the movement of the chi. Why is the chi energy around? Why is there chi energy coursing around? And we get a certain kind of ancient cosmological explanation of that in this discussion of the Taijitu. Okay, so all right. I'll see you soon. We're going to do the Han Dynasty next. Look at some art and stuff like that. Okay, I'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.